Hey everyone, this is Harrison at Sterling Chiropractic, and on today's segment with Donuts with Doc, we're talking about the importance of stretching before and after a game. So Doc, any suggestions?
Well, when we're stretching and when we're preparing for activity, it's a great thing for us to do something that's called dynamic, sport-specific warm-ups. The day and age of us just statically or just stationarily just dropping down and stretching is a thing of the past. There was a lot of research that was done actually to determine whether that's a good thing or if there's a different way of doing it. And Punjabi et al. Actually decided and found out that it wasn't as beneficial to stretch prior to. It doesn't limit your accidents or the possibility of accidents. And unbeknownst to regular theology, it actually decreases power output as opposed to increases power output or performance. So what I always tell my patients is go ahead and do a dynamic warm-up, which is sport specific. Obviously, I'm not going to stretch the legs if it's something that's only going to be upper body and vice versa. And then I tell people to go ahead and go through with their activity. Following activity is when we actually need to do that static stretching that we're so used to, say from gym class or even from Pee Wee sports. So you're an athlete. What is typically your biggest issue that you have when you're trying to get ready for game or practice?
Hip flexors for sure.
Hip flexors. Well, and that being a soccer-specific injury or situation, it's definitely something that is pertinent to what that is. So some of the things that I would encourage people to do, especially, let's just say soccer players in general, is to literally warm up the hips, warm up the hip flexors, and get them prepared for activity. As you're striking through the ball, you're using a lot of hip flexion, so that can typically contract a muscle, especially if it's preseason or something along those lines.
So Doc, you know my situation with my hips. How should I stretch them before a game?
Well, and like we were talking about earlier, we're looking at a dynamic, sport-specific warm-up, and as a soccer player, we're going to really focus in on the hip flexors. So some of the things that I would do if I were preparing for a game, just kind of a march in place where we're actually opposing arms and opposing legs. Once we go through that, about 5, 10, 15 seconds, then we can actually start working on opening and closing up both of the hips as we're kind of moving. Obviously with a confined space here, we're kind of limited, but you would either be skipping or walking as you're doing that. The third thing that I would also recommend is kind of a walking lunge. So as you're walking, you're kind of walking through and doing a lunge. The last thing I would probably do, especially hip flexor specific, would be kind of a lateral lunge as we're kind of walking in place or kind of moving side to side.
All right, that was before game. What about after a game?
Well, and that's what we were talking about earlier as far as the static stretching. Obviously, everybody knows the hamstrings where we're just kind of bending over and just letting it hang for about 45 or 60 seconds. The other thing that I encourage patients to do is to get those hip flexors where we actually have one knee on the ground, one knee up, and we're actually just leaning forward as we're slightly arching our back. The key here is to kind of drop that pelvis down to the floor. As you start becoming more and more flexible, this is not going to be as effective. So what we need to do is then go into what's called a high lunge. We're in the same kind of position. We're still dropping that pelvis down. We just have a little bit more space to work with. Once that becomes very, very easy, then we go into what's called a low lunge. And we're going to do that on both sides, about 60 seconds, especially following activity like in a game or practice or something along those lines.
Also, a lot of sports you use your quads, your hamstrings because you run a lot. What do you suggest before a game? How to stretch those?
Well, and that's a good thing. What we can do is quads and hamstrings. You can actually do kind of a walking reach and grab. So you're here and you're kind of leaning forward as you're walking forward. And you're going to work to the other side and do the exact same thing. That's really going to work your quads. Some of your hamstrings, what you can do is either come down and sweep on both sides as you're kind of walking forward or backwards.
After the game, does normal quad stretch and hamstring stretch, or what should you do?
Well, no, that's the perfect time where you have to do that static stretch where you're just literally hold it in that position, try to elongate the muscle, and try to return it back to the tone that we want it to. We have to remember is that once we reestablish that tone, the muscle can recover quicker, less soreness, and a whole lot less prone to injuries following activities.
All right. Well, thank you, Doc. You heard it here. Catch us next week with Donuts with Doc.